Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. If you have a cell phone, please silence it at this time. Upcoming at the end of July is the next People's University, July 31st. It starts, and it's a 4-week program on large mammals, so zoology. We have instructors from the Pittsburgh Zoo and from West Liberty, and we'll talk about elephants and primates, great apes and the big cats, hippos, rhinos, giraffes, all the big animals that walk the earth. And then we'll take a field trip to the zoo on August 28th, which will be paid for. You don't have to pay, but you do have to provide your own transportation to and from the zoo. We can't take you for liability reasons. But if you want to join us, first of all, on the program, there's a sign up here. And if you want to go on the field trip, it'll be the first 20 who come to the programs. If you sign up and don't come to the programs, then we'll replace you with somebody else. That's the only fair way to do it. But if you want to sign up today, you can do that. The sheets are up here, but please don't sign up if you're not going to go through with the whole thing. Okay? You'll get a behind-the-scenes look at the animal feeding of probably elephants, maybe gorillas, and it should be a good time and an informative one. Next week, on the 8th, the Wheeling Poetry Series. C.J. Farnsworth and Frank Leonard, Mark Harshman, Poet Laureate of our state, is the host and curator of that program. That'll be July 8th at noon. And in 2 weeks, on July 15th, the book is called Enchanted Ground. It's about the spirit room of Jonathan Koons, and the author is Sharon Hatfield. This was a 19th century phenomenon, these spirit rooms, and you'll learn all about it. It's kind of like the paranormal TV show of its time. Today, we have with us William Kerrigan. He's a professor emeritus at Muskingum University in New Concord, Ohio. He has written a book called West Virginia's War that you see up here. He has copies if you'd like one. See him after the program. He is also the author of Johnny Appleseed and the American Orchard from Johns Hopkins University Press, and numerous articles and local histories. He's been leading groups of students on Civil War tours of Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia over the past 15 years. Please welcome William Kerrigan.
Thank you, Sean, and I'm excited to be here in Wheeling. I am not a West Virginian, but I live just an hour west of here in a little town called New Concord, Ohio, in Muskingum County. And when I was a young assistant professor and my wife was in seminary, she did her internship just across the river at Bridgeport, so we spent a lot of time there. The other really positive experience I've had in Wheeling that showed me what wonderful people live here. It was that when I was younger and thinner, I was a runner, which I'm not anymore, and I ran the Wheeling 20K, which is a really, really hard race with lots of hills. But what was so remarkable about that, as I went all of those 12-something miles, was the number of people who came out to cheer me on, just me personally, but other people too. It was amazing, and particularly at those hills when you're really, am I going to make it up this hill? Having middle school bands, having preachers, having just citizens out there cheering you on was great. I remember the last steep hill, I guess that's Wheeling Hill, before you come down. That's the steepest hill. It's maybe not the longest hill, but it's the steepest hill on the course. And there was a preacher at the bottom, and she was saying, called out my race number. You, Mr. 236, let Jesus help you up this hill. Jesus. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready. And Jesus helped me up that hill. So I ran a lot of different races in a lot of different towns and cities when I was a runner, and I never, ever saw anything like the level of community support that I saw in Wheeling. So speaks really, really well of your town. So you should be proud to be from this awesome place. Okay, yeah. I also think it's a beautiful historic town, and with a really interesting downtown. And I know that downtowns of small, older cities all around the country struggle to stay alive and compete with suburban development and stuff. But I stopped on my way in, and I got coffee at a fancy coffee shop by the bridge, and I walked over, looked at the bridge again. There's still a lot of really interesting stuff down here that people really should come to see. It's a great city to be in. Okay. So now, as an Ohioan, this book just came out 2 weeks ago. I've been working on it, really began working on it in the middle of the pandemic, which was a challenge because some of the archives I needed to visit were not open, but I found a lot of archivists who would scan documents for me and send them to me when I couldn't access them. But this is something I worked on for a number of years, but this is my first talk on this book because it just came out. And here I am, an Ohioan, and I'm going to talk to a bunch of West Virginians and tell them about their history. And that reminds me of an experience I had many years ago when I had written a book on Johnny Appleseed. And Johnny Appleseed was a Swedenborgian, which is an obscure Christian sect. And the Swedenborgians asked me to come speak about Johnny Appleseed's faith, and I thought, I'm either going to just tell them stuff they already know or that they think are completely wrong. And I was nervous about that. But Swedenborgians, like West Virginians, are really nice people. And so I feel a little bit like that, but I invite you, and when we get to questions and comments, to challenge me on something. If you think, I don't think that's quite right, based on your knowledge of West Virginia history and your family stories and other things. I'm always, when you write a book, one of the things I've learned when you write a book, that is not the end point of your learning of that topic. That's just the beginning. As you go around and start talking to people, you start to learn more. So I invite you to tell me if you think I'm off base on anything. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this book. It is what's called a primary source reader. So it is a collection of about 120 primary sources, firsthand accounts by West Virginians and by soldiers who were in West Virginia during the war, edited with a long introductory chapter by me, kind of explaining how I understand West Virginia's origin story in the Civil War, and then chapter introductions as well as short introductions to the documents. So there's a lot of firsthand account, and there's a lot of me in there too. The book, I think, reading this book for someone who knows nothing about West Virginia, I hope, will help them understand West Virginia's unique Civil War history. And I know that in writing this book, even though I had been visiting West Virginia with Civil War tours, I've been teaching broadly Civil War history for 30 years. When I started writing this book, I started to learn that some of the things I thought about West Virginia and why it separated were not really right. And so I'm going to talk about some of those, what I would say are myths about West Virginia's origins. Now, to give you a couple of examples of what you would find if you were to read this book, excerpts include a very water-stained and barely legible, but nonetheless fascinating excerpt of a journal of a teenage girl named Samantha Atkinson in Putnam County, who was from a pro-Confederate family and had Union soldiers invade her house searching for the men and weapons. You'll also read excerpts of the letters between John Davis and Anna Kennedy, who were betrothed to be married. John Davis supported the Union, and Anna Kennedy supported the Confederacy. And despite their disagreements, they actually got married and had a long, happy marriage. You'll read Stonewall Jackson's observations of witnessing John Brown's hanging, which I find fascinating because as much as these two men are very opposite sides, they're both deeply religious men and both driven by their moral conviction that they are on the right side. They are more alike than you would ever imagine. Parts of the trial transcript of a slave named Reuben who was accused of plotting an insurrection in Greenbrier County, and also a letter that a Ohio soldier, Thomas Taylor, wrote back to his wife, and in rather matter-of-fact language described some of the brutal justice they inflicted on families that they believe were aligned with bushwhackers on the other side. So that's just a few examples. I tried to create a volume that represented all the different parts of the state and perspectives of men and women and black and white and soldier and civilian. Yeah. And also I've learned driving around West Virginia is, for a small state, this is a really big state. Like I used to live in Texas, and I'm convinced that if you flattened West Virginia out, which you shouldn't do because it's beautiful because of all those mountains, it would be bigger than Texas. It really is. There are 5 or 6 different West Virginias within West Virginia, I think. And that was also for me a really interesting and fascinating thing to learn. So a big question I asked myself from the beginning is, why was West Virginia created? And was it inevitable? Was it foreordained that West Virginia would separate from Virginia as I'm researching this topic? And could we have imagined a alternative where either West Virginia never separates, or West Virginia separates but is either smaller or larger than the current West Virginia? Okay. So sometimes I hang out with some people who are board game nerds, and I started thinking, could I make this into a board game? And as you can see from this picture, I'm not an artist, but I made a primitive version of a board game called Winning West Virginia, only one copy that I own. And the idea was to break West Virginia and also add the Shenandoah Valley into regions and allow for a possibility that one side playing the Mountaineers and one side playing the Old Dominion could come up with a different result. That contingency in history, that actions of individuals and actions of groups of individuals can sometimes change things, even while there are broader forces that might lean towards an inevitability of separation, for example. So in this game, you would win if you secured 4 of the 7 regions I kind of defined, and I'm sure there's some problems with these regions. And you could conceivably win the Shenandoah Valley for the Union for West Virginia, but I also, through cards and rules, made it much less likely that Shenandoah Valley was ever going to become part of West Virginia, and much less likely that the Northern Panhandle would ever have stayed part of the Confederacy in that sense. So it was a useful and fun exercise to think about the way different things that happen shape this final outcome. How many of the people that end up in the West Virginia that existed actually supported that idea? And to what extent are the boundaries of West Virginia also the reflection of geography, of strategic aims, of economy, and of the actions of soldiers in different regions, so who decided this is going to be the way it is, whether the people here or not want it that way. So anyway, that is something that I've kept in mind as I explore this topic, and it's a question I still find fascinating. Now, I want to talk about what I would call some of the myths of West Virginia. And a myth isn't necessarily untrue. A myth can be a widespread, broadly held belief that's mostly true, but maybe deserves a little bit of questioning. So the first of these myths, there's actually a myth and a counter myth. And I think then where I would come in as a truth is the myth of anti-slavery West Virginia, okay? And before I explored this was, West Virginia separated because they didn't really have slaves and they weren't interested in slavery, and so they weren't going to fight a war to protect slavery. And that's not untrue entirely, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. And one of the reasons it's more complicated than that is that the word anti-slavery is a very big tent. There's a lot of different ways you could be against slavery, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But some of the ways in which the anti-slavery is what created West Virginia are true can be seen on this map from the 1860 census of Virginia. And in this map, the darker the county is, the higher percentage of people who lived in that county were enslaved. So you see in the Piedmont Tidewater area, counties like Nottoway were 74% of the people were enslaved. So enslaved people vastly outnumbered the free. Obviously, in a county like that, the whites in that county are deeply, deeply invested in protecting and perpetuating slavery. And then you have the lighter counties where there's little to no slavery. And you can see on that map a lot of the shape of West Virginia are counties like this one, where 0.4% of the people in Ohio County were enslaved in 1860. You did have a few exceptions. Kanawha County had 13.7% enslaved, and Putnam, right next to it, 9.2%. You also had in Monroe County and Greenbrier County in the far south, over 10% of those people were enslaved as well. So that does reinforce the idea that this was about slavery, and this was about a lot of Westerners not wanting to break up the Union to protect that economic interest. Okay. In 1849, a historian named Henry Howe, who went around the United States in the early decades of the 19th century and compiled these big histories. He published Henry Howe's Historical Collections of Virginia, and in that book, he included these two sketches. He talked about Virginia in 1849 as being two Virginias, and the sketch that he presented for Eastern Virginia was a plantation, okay? And the sketch he presented for West Virginia was this mountainous region, a mountain man out in the wilderness. And he talked about these very big differences. So East and West did absolutely. They had huge cultural, economic, political, social differences before the Civil War. And they went way back. And that's definitely part of the story there. This seal, which I'll also say, I think is like the best state seal. It's got so much cool stuff in it. This is actually the coat of arms with the full color version. Also reinforces the idea of anti-slavery as being central to West Virginia's origins. The very slogan, "Mountaineers are always free," the opposite of freedom is slavery, reinforces that. And while you don't have anything explicitly about slavery in this, you have two white men who embody the free labor idea, the idea of laborers that own their own bodies and make their own choices about how they use their labor. You've got in the Union coat, a man cradling the forester's axe, but also with one hand on the farmer's plow and sheaves the wheat behind him. And then you have the miner with his pickaxe, and behind him is the cooper, which is a symbol of trade, and the anvil, a symbol of industry. And so in this image, there's so much going on, and it's all about a free labor economy as opposed to a slave labor economy. Now, at the bottom, there's this little cap there, okay? And Hugh Distabar, who drew this, I think, was making an explicit anti-slavery statement with that cap. That's called the Phrygian cap, or sometimes it's called the Liberty cap, and it goes all the way back to Roman times. It was a big, powerful symbol in the American Revolution, the Liberty cap. By the 1840s and 1850s, it increasingly became associated with anti-slavery. And in fact, when Congress in the 1850s was designing the new Congress Capitol, they were going to put Lady Liberty on top of it, and there was a sculptor who designed the original version. Lady Liberty was wearing a Phrygian cap. And the Secretary of War at that time, a man named Jefferson Davis, said, no, that's a symbol of slavery. You know, we white people in America were never slaves. So slaves were given the cap in Rome, in Roman history, when they gained their freedom. We were never slaves. We want her to have a helmet or something else on her head. So people would have recognized that little cap in the center as also a statement about anti-slavery. And so certainly many, many West Virginians believed that slavery was wrong and that it was good that it ended. And so that is one of the ways in which this anti-slavery myth is mostly true. And I'll talk about the ways it can be modified a little bit in a second. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about this myth, which is called the pro-slavery West Virginia myth. And this was perpetuated in a book, came out a few years ago by Scott McKenzie. Any chance he came to talk here? Scott McKenzie come to talk here? Yeah, okay. And this book argues that no, West Virginians weren't anti-slavery at all. They were extremely pro-slavery, and the reason that they separated was because they said, look, if you separate from the Union, there won't be any fugitive slave law. So when slaves run from Western Virginia to Ohio, Ohio will have no obligation to return them. And so Mackenzie makes this argument that Western Virginians were as ferociously pro-slavery as Eastern Virginians, okay? I think it's nonsense. I'm going to tell you why. So first of all, the beginning of his book, the very first sentence when I opened this book, really raised my eyebrow. Every account of West Virginia's creation is wrong. Now, I remember when I started graduate school in history decades ago, and maybe at that young age I had this fantasy that I'm going to discover some document that's going to completely overturn the way people understand some event in the past. But if you do seriously study history, whatever's new to you, whatever topic's new to you, you quickly learn there have been a lot of professional and amateur historians laboring in that field for a long time. And you would be wise to respect what they've unearthed. The idea that 160 years of West Virginians writing their history got everything completely wrong is not a credible idea. Okay? And so he goes on to say that, they all said the same thing for 160 years. And I was reading historians, West Virginia historians who were writing in the 1870s and the 1900s and 1950s. They're not all saying the same thing. There are some changes in interpretation and emphasis. So this idea that white West Virginians were as strongly pro-slavery as Eastern Virginians is not one that I think is credible. And I think the key point to understanding what really undermines the argument is when push came to shove and Congress said West Virginia can't become a state unless it sets slavery onto a path of extinction, you had John Carlyle and a couple of people object and abandon the statehood movement. The overwhelming majority of white West Virginians said, okay, that's fine. Okay. People who are deeply committed to an institution like slavery would not have said that. Okay, so let's look more at how West Virginians felt about slavery and how slavery was, the issue of slavery was always part of the tension between East and West. This is what I'd talk about as the truth of West Virginia's attitudes towards slavery. And part of that truth is that the state of Virginia from the beginning had been politically dominated by elite slaveholders in the East who had a lot of wealth and a lot of investment in slave labor. And they had always been jealous about sharing political power with the West, where poorer people were farming on their own or developing their own industries and doing other kinds of work. They always saw the non-slaveholding whites as a potential threat to their economic interests. And so they were, from the outset, stingy with extending equal political representation to new Western areas. They were one of the last states, Virginia was one of the last states to drop property qualifications for whites to vote. So if a white male early on, until in 1850, you didn't to vote in Virginia, you had to be a white male, but you also had to own a substantial amount of property. And if you didn't own that, you didn't have the right to vote. In 1829, 1830, Westerners pushed for reform of the Constitution, and they got nowhere. And this man, Benjamin Watkins Lee, a wealthy slaveholder from the East, said something in those debates, arguing against extending the right to vote to poor white Westerners. He said, I ask gentlemen to say whether they believe that those who are obliged to depend on their daily labor for their subsistence can or do ever enter into political affairs. They never do, they never will, they never can. Now, what real share, so far as my mind is concerned, does any man suppose the peasantry of the West can or will take in affairs of state? Oh, West Virginians did not forget that insult. That this elite Easterner was calling them peasants, okay, and saying because they are essentially peasants, because it's not honorable to do physical labor yourself, that real gentlemen have other people do it for them, and they're the ones who should have the vote. That outrageous idea really sat badly with Westerners who were laboring as free laborers, and that frustration continued all the way up to the Civil War. Now, in the Second Constitutional Convention of 1850-51, the West was now growing much faster than the East. They did finally get the dropping of property qualifications for voters, but the East still was able to jerry-rig the assembly until the date of 1865, had the Civil War not happened, so that the East would still have majority power in the legislature. And the Easterners continued an unequal form of taxation. So if you had property in the West and your property was your land or your factory or your tools, you were taxed at the total value of all those things. But if you had slaves, the taxation on slave was capped at $300, even if that was a slave who was worth $2,500. So there was an unequal tax burden, and the East would not let go of that. And the East was very, as they controlled politics, very stingy with spending money on roads and canals and improvements that the West really needed so that they could thrive and develop. So all of that is the long history of East and West, and behind all of that is slavery. Okay? And so in this image, I think you see the celebration of free labor, and West Virginians really were anti-slavery. But anti-slavery doesn't just mean abolitionist. Okay? An abolitionist is a person who has come to the conclusion that slavery is morally wrong and against God's laws, and it should be ended immediately. Okay? There were few abolitionists in West Virginia. Okay? However, right across the river in Ohio, there also weren't very many abolitionists. Even in northern states, on the eve of the Civil War, moral opposition to slavery was held by 5, maybe 10% of the population. There was a broader anti-slavery, however, and that had a lot to do with frustration, a couple of things. One was the idea that slave labor was a backwards institution. It was inefficient. It was impeding the development of technology because the wealthy were putting all their money into buying more humans rather than buying technology. Okay? That it's the past, not the future. And there was also an anti-slavery that said, we are sick and tired of elite slaveholders controlling the federal government and having the federal government doing its bidding, the slave power, as they called it. Okay? Now, because Western Virginians were part of Virginia, they wouldn't use terms like free soil, which was associated with the Northern Republican Party. But Western Virginians thought the exact same thing. They had very specific reasons for a long history of these elite slaveholders in the East treating them unequally and restricting their rights. That's a form of anti-slavery too. So getting back to that question, was West Virginia anti-slavery? Yes, it was. It was against the institution, against the power of the elite slaveholders. That didn't necessarily mean that the average white West Virginian had come to believe in racial equality, had a deep moral awakening about the wrongness of slavery. But Western Virginians' attitudes towards slavery were not really much different than white Ohioans' attitudes towards slavery. And they were more tied into these bigger issues of the slave power. Okay, so I want to talk about a few other things. Another thing that sort of always drives me a little crazy about this is this idea that the Civil War really didn't happen in West Virginia, it happened somewhere else. You know, that we think about the Civil War as happening at Gettysburg and Antietam and Chattanooga and Chickamauga, and here in West Virginia we have small battles like Rich Mountain and Droop Mountain and Scary Creek, and the big mega battles for the most part happen elsewhere. Therefore, this was a sideshow to the Civil War. I found this map online of a 5th grade social studies class teaching the Civil War and said theaters of the Civil War. The Eastern Theater is just basically all around Richmond, the fight to take Richmond, plus a couple of the Confederates' attempts to take the war into the North. And then the Western Theater is everything that happens on the other side of the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, where you also have a lot of battles. West Virginia doesn't even get a theater. It's as if the war didn't happen here. And this is maybe one of the more extreme examples of ignoring the war experiences of places like West Virginia. But it's built on the assumption that the war happened where you had these big chess piece battles of armies moving against armies. But war in the 19th century is not just about big armies moving against armies. Wars embody everyone in the society. Everyone has to take a side. Everybody is vulnerable to the side they take. Everybody is potentially victimized by their neighbors on the other side. Civilians can support armies coming in, or they can resist armies coming in. They can sometimes be victimized by those armies coming in. West Virginians experienced war the same way most Americans experienced the Civil War, and they were the first in many ways. The first amputation of a war that became characterized by amputations occurred at the Battle of Philippi, when James Hanger was hit by a cannonball and had to have his whole leg removed, and then he went on to found a prosthetics company which still exists today that makes prosthetic arms and legs for people. But the Civil War saw tens of thousands of amputations because these soft lead bullets fired at a pretty low velocity, if they hit an arm or a leg, they didn't cut a clean break on that. They just turned a big part of the bone to shards, and there were no surgeons at the time that could do anything about that. So that's why you get so many arms and legs amputated. And one of the songs that was sold as a song sheet during the Civil War is called "The Empty Sleeve," which is about that phenomenon of seeing people come back to your town missing an arm and having one sleeve pinned up. That started in West Virginia. Bushwhacking, the idea of people who aren't in formal armies, but who are lurking and taking opportunities to target one army or the other. That's very much part of the West Virginia War. And while we often think about Gettysburg as the war, big set-piece battles, a lot of the war was about these insurgencies, these terror attacks, these kind of vicious local fighting that happened. And West Virginians endured that very deeply for the whole war. And so West Virginia's war is very much the real Civil War in my book. Okay. Another I think myth that you see, or let's say maybe not a myth, but something that has been underexplored, is the role that African Americans played in West Virginia's war. Okay. West Virginia's war helped, African Americans helped determine the outcome of the war, helped determine that the war would become, a war that started as a war to restore the Union, would become a war to end slavery. And one of those stories you probably are familiar with, the local young woman named Lucy Bagby, who was ran away from a local man named William Goshorn, made her way to Cleveland, Ohio, And when Goshorn found she was there and sent agents to seize her, she was dragged before local magistrates in Cleveland under the Fugitive Slave Act, and the judge ultimately decided that she should be returned to slavery. Now, this all happened in December, January, between the time Lincoln had been elected, but he has not yet been inaugurated, and everybody's afraid the war is going to begin. Bagby, I believe, is the last person returned to slavery under the Fugitive Slave Act. And the argument that Goshorn made when he tried to get her back and successfully got her back is Northerners need to show these seceding southern states that they can be trusted to return slaves if they want to save the Union. So taking this young woman's liberty is a noble act because it saves the Union, okay? And there was a Maryland poet and abolitionist named Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, an African-American woman, who wrote this very scathing poem in response to that argument. It's titled "To the Cleveland Union Savers." And she's really, really calling them out for their hypocrisy. Two of the verses are here. It's a longer poem. But she writes, "On your Union's bloody altar was your helpless victim laid. Mercy, truth, and justice shuddered, but your hands would give no aid. And you sent her back to torture, stripped of freedom, robbed of right, thrust the wretched captive stranger back to slavery's gloomy night." So he really calls her out. She is returned to Wheeling. Then Goshorn sends her south, fearing she'll run away again. Goshorn, despite the fact that he sort of said, hey, if you return my slave, I'll be loyal to the Union, he refused to sign the loyalty oath. And he was sent to Camp Chase in Ohio, and then he got tired of Camp Chase, so he said, okay, I'll sign the loyalty oath. But it didn't change him. She ended up earning her emancipation after the Emancipation Proclamation came into effect, went back to Ohio, and she's buried in a cemetery near Cleveland today. She lived a long, long life, Lucy Bagby. So, Lucy Bagby Johnson. Anyway, this is from the start of the war, actions like those of Lucy are forcing white Americans to say, what are we fighting for? What's this war about? And forcing them to tackle the slavery issue. Okay. In southern West Virginia, a Presbyterian minister named Samuel Houston talked about the vibe in Monroe County, where about 10% of the population was enslaved, as the crisis, the secession crisis, developed. And in his diary is full of references to his fear particularly of slave insurrections. A couple of notable things. On May 15th, 1861, he said, the stage driver brought intelligence that a disturbance among the Negroes in Lewisburg has just occurred. It has produced something of a panic among us. So this fear that black West Virginians will rise up and free themselves is very much in the minds of many slave-holding communities. On May 22nd, he gives a sermon, and in the Presbyterian church, slaves come to the same church. They sit in the back pews, but they all hear the same sermon. And he writes in his diary, "Have heard that the Negroes express a strong dislike for the sermon I lately preached, proving that the war on our side, being defensive, is a just one." So he's mindful that African Americans are forming their own political opinions about this conflict, and it's kind of unsettling him a little bit. Okay. You also see in West Virginia some of the first African Americans take advantage of the presence of Union armies to emancipate themselves. Now, down near Fayetteville, Rutherford B. Hayes, Lieutenant Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, who later goes on to be president, happened to be a pretty strongly anti-slavery person. And early in the war, before the Emancipation Proclamation comes into effect, any enslaved person that runs to Union lines doesn't necessarily know that they're going to get protection. And some of the Union commanders are pro-slavery and will send them back and hand them right back over to slaveholders. So they're taking risks. Hayes was anti-slavery, and he used a couple of laws that Congress passed early in the year, the First and Second Confiscation Acts. He interpreted them liberally to basically say, I'm allowed to free any runaway slaves that come to my camp. Hayes also saw these people as really valuable intelligence assets because they came from hearts of territories that were controlled by the Confederacy. So whenever soldiers found what were called a contraband, a runaway slave, coming into the camp, they were to tell Rutherford B. Hayes, because he wanted to interview them. He wanted to know what they knew about what are the conditions in the town that's occupied by Confederates. How many troops are there? How's the morale and all of those things? And Charles did just that, this contraband who came into the camp. He interviewed him. He talked about, Charles said that the situation in Monroe County was the support for the Confederacy was starting to splinter as poor whites were resenting that they were forced to go on night patrols to make sure slaves weren't running away. And they didn't own slaves, and they were doing this to protect the property of the rich. And so you start to see some divides, and Charles, as well as several other contraband who came to Hayes's camp, Hayes wrote letters for them and sent them on to Ohio to see specific people, and the letters would say, employ this person, find this person a job, because they're a good worker and they deserve that right to be free. So he became kind of his own self-emancipator even before the Emancipation Proclamation occurred. You also saw for African Americans, the war could have very high stakes, even higher stakes than it did for whites when armies or control of one area or another shifted significantly. While the Union had a good first year in Western Virginia, in the fall of 1862, the Confederacy made some big inroads pushing back in. They temporarily occupied Charleston for about 6 weeks, and then Stonewall Jackson forced the surrender of 12,000 Union troops at Harper's Ferry. Both of these are happening about the same time. In the case of Charleston, there were a lot of African Americans who had effectively become free since their masters had gone off to fight for the Confederacy, and they were living free. And with this Confederate army coming in, they all fled. There was descriptions of find anything that can float and float down that's the Little Kanawha, or is that the Kanawha? That's the Kanawha. Float down the Kanawha to the Ohio River to get away from these Confederates who will re-enslave you. So it's brought a lot of terror to them. And in Harper's Ferry, at the time that the Union surrendered, there were about 2,000 runaway slaves living in tent camps in the city. And when that surrender happened, those people were all rounded up, returned to slavery. A lot of them had local slave masters who immediately put them on trains to Richmond to sell. And there are accounts of these Harper's Ferry refugees, train carloads of them going into Richmond and being auctioned off. A woman who was a hospital administrator in Harper's Ferry at the time, named Abba Goddard, described the scene in a very long letter. And she wrote, with the influx of rebel troops came the human hyenas in search of their living prey. Every nook, corner, cranny, barn, and sty has been searched, and men, women, and little children in droves have been carried off. It's a pretty shocking experience. So these things it was actually very hard to find these stories. The newspapers weren't necessarily reporting on them. I had to really dig into personal letters to find more about the experiences of African Americans with the shifting tides of the war. You also had some free black farmers in West Virginia. This is a document by the Southern Claims Commission after the war in 1871. The Grant administration set up a program that said any person who was loyal to the Union who had any of their property confiscated by Union armies during the war could issue a claim and get compensated by the government. And these Claims Commission reports that run about 50, 60 pages long, I only have a very short excerpt in the book, are good at telling the stories of individuals. And this one told the story of a free black farmer in Monroe County. Despite the fact that slavery, most people in Monroe County who were black were enslaved, it was a small number of free black farmers. And he, towards the end of the war, when Union forces returning from a raid into southwestern Virginia came marching through Union, they took his horse The Union Army took his horse, and he then followed the Union Army to Ohio, maybe because he thought, well, without my horse, I can't farm. But after the war, he returned to Monroe County, began farming again, and he filed a claim. And they found, yes, you were loyal, and yes, you had your property taken, and he was paid $125 for the value of his horse. So those are very interesting documents as well. Okay. I want to save some time for questions, so I'm going to skip this idea of the Civil War among West Virginians. The feuds lingered for decades. If you want to ask me questions about that, we can. You can, but I want to give you time to talk, and then just tell you also the final chapter of the book, which I really enjoyed putting together more than any others. It was inspired by the statues on the Capitol grounds in Charleston. There are 4 Civil War statues on the Capitol ground. The first one in 1910 is a statue to Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate. Okay. 2 years later, in 1912, they put up a statue to the Mountaineer, to not a somebody enrolled in a formal Union unit, but in a Home Guard unit. Okay. And then in 1930, they finally put a more traditional Union soldier statue up. And not until 1974 did they put up a statue to Lincoln. And it's a very kind of interesting, somber statue of Lincoln, based on a poem by Vashel Lindsay called Lincoln Walks at Midnight. And these 4 monuments, to me, really represent the ways in which West Virginians are still struggling to understand their history and the meaning of their history. So for each of those, I have the monuments and the text on the monuments, and then I included newspaper accounts of what people were saying about the monuments when they were installed. And those were very enlightening as well. It's very interesting to see what the black newspaper in Charleston was saying about the Stonewall Jackson Monument in 1910. They revealed a lot of details that the white newspapers didn't about those events. But I want to stop there because I want to have time for you guys to ask me questions or to challenge me on things. And I do have copies of the book if you are interested in purchasing a copy. They're $25. It just came out from Ohio University Press 2 weeks ago. And I can sign them or I cannot sign them. But let me just first open it up for questions.
Just raise your hand if you have questions. I will come to you with the mic. Anyone? Okay, I'm coming.
You said earlier that there are multiple interpretations, areas of emphasis that describe what might be the reason for our split from Virginia.
Uh-huh.
And one of the areas of emphasis that I noticed in your lecture that came up quite often was the emphasis on what we would call class.
Paul?
So,
Class, okay, yeah.
So, in your estimation, is that the largest reason for our split? That split between class, between poor and rich, between the ownership class and those who don't own land? Is that the biggest driver for our split, or would you say something else is?
That's a really good question, and I think it is mostly class, but I don't think it's explicitly class. I really do think it is about 2 different economic systems. Those people who are invested in perpetuating slave labor versus those people who are interested in a free labor economy. And those in the free labor economy include successful builders of factories and other industries that don't depend upon on slave labor. So there are some successful, what we would call at least middle class or upper middle class people who feel as strongly in their resentment against the slave power as poorer people. Now, one of the mitigating things is we have to reconcile that in 19th century, all whites were raised, whether they were North and South, with belief in white supremacy, belief that God made white people better than, and that's hard to overcome. So even if you really resent the slave holders and how they're controlling government and manipulating things for that, that still it's psychologically it's a much bigger jump to break away to embracing racial equality or having compassion with people of other colors whose conditions are worse, because that's been sort of baked into you wherever you live in the country. It's been baked into you from childhood. But it is a little bit of class, but it's not explicitly class, because there are non-slaveholding capitalists who also are frustrated with the ways in which the slaveholding class is skewing things and hindering their ability. Those capitalists need the good roads and they need the railroads so that when they are producing goods, they can get them to markets. And if the slaveholding government in the East is saying, well, we don't want to spend enough money on those, that's a big, important issue. One of the most interesting documents I found was from far western Virginia, Point Pleasant, and it was a reaction to John Brown's raid. And the people of the community said, we sympathize with people in Harpers Ferry who are living in terror after the violence of the raid, and we want to keep Virginia united. But the best way you could keep it united is if people in Richmond finally agree to finance the railroad all the way to the Ohio River and start not just building from the east, but build from the west and the east at the same time. And that was their plea, and it fell on deaf ears. Virginia government didn't accelerate its growth of the railroad, didn't start building on the western end. So economics, a lot of the wealthy people in the West who wanted those connections felt like the slaveholders were holding them back.
Any other questions?
I am always surprised when we used to live in Florida. I was born in West Virginia, but we've been to Florida, Bahamas, and different places like that. I am always surprised when people say, well, where are you from? We'll say Wheeling, West Virginia. And they'll say, oh, that's by Richmond. No, no. Oh, you're from Western Virginia. I'm like, no, West Virginia is a real live state.
Yes.
Why do you think that happens? Is it a historical type of thing? Or is it people don't know geography?
That's a good question. I mean, and I don't know that I can totally answer that, but I do believe that until 10 or 20 years ago, most of the national histories of the Civil War ignored West Virginia, and that was partly because traditional histories focused on the big battles, and so they focused on those areas. West Virginia, I mean, if you look broadly at how American history is taught for decades and decades, American history was all about the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, and that's because Harvard University is in Massachusetts, and they were producing all the historians. So there is a way in which where history is produced can affect what gets paid attention to. So West Virginia has a couple of great universities, in West Virginia University and Marshall University, but it doesn't have Harvard and Yale, it doesn't have a Michigan or Ohio State. And if regional histories bubble up from the places that they're at, places that have the more long-standing and prestigious and wealthy universities, their areas tend to get more attention in the national histories. I think that's part of it. Yeah. It's a good question.
Do you have any information or thoughts on the recent, when I say recent, within the last 25 years, the lawsuit by the state of Virginia against the state of West Virginia to recover some of the economic value? There was apparently a lawsuit that made it to the Supreme Court where the state of Virginia was trying to recover financial reward because West Virginia absconded with what's now West Virginia.
I didn't know this was a Supreme Court case. I know that it was an issue after the war, and how much, if you're separating West Virginia, how much of the state debt does West Virginia have to take on? I don't have any information, but it's an interesting political development. There was also, I remember a few years ago, a movement by people in Frederick County, Virginia, to secede from a Virginia that they saw as becoming bluer and join a redder West Virginia, because Frederick had the option of joining West Virginia originally. If they could have voted themselves in, I guess. So there are these lingering issues like that, but I don't know anything about that law case. I'll have to look that up. Sounds very interesting. Yeah.
Little anecdotal story for you. Lucy Bagley was my great-great-grandmother's au pair. And
Wow.
and incidentally, they pronounce the name Gosshorn.
Gosshorn, okay.
Not Goshorn.
Okay, Gosshorn.
Gosshorn. And they were basically Charleston people, but John Gosshorn was a very well-to-do industrialist.
Wow.
And he bought Lucy Bagley for $100, I think's the number,
Uh-huh.
for his son William.
Okay.
And then when she escaped, they had that awful decision about the Fugitive
Yeah.
Slave Act, maybe one of the worst acts ever.
Yeah.
And they both went to Cleveland.
Okay. Yeah.
And young Gosshorn William was carrying a firearm, and it got very testy in Cleveland. But anyhow, the judge held his nose and ruled because it was the law.
Right.
In
Yeah.
favor, and they took her back to Charleston. And then she left there, escaped, and went to Pittsburgh, married a fellow, and walked to Cleveland.
Wow.
But she had spent a number of years in Wheeling in the Gosshorn home,
Mm-hmm.
taking care of my great-great-grandmother.
Wow.
And later on, she decided she wanted to see the Gosshorns again. So that word got back to Wheeling. They sent her a train ticket. She took the train, came back to Wheeling, and spent 8 days in Wheeling. So it was not, it was a friendly kind of enslavement, if there is such a thing.
Yeah.
And when she left, they gave her a mink stole and a pair of false teeth.
Wow, that is an amazing story, and I think it speaks to the reality of it. When you have institutions like slavery, which we can look at and say these are so oppressive, it still puts the oppressed and the oppressor in these close and intimate relationships. And even if it's a very exploitive institution, even the exploited can form bonds with those people who are claiming them as property, and that seems like a really great example of that. That's a fascinating story. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Well, yeah, I mean, we talk about like and Patty Hearst and those kind of things at Stockholm, and it could be that, and it's also just broadly, sometimes we use this term, well, nobody uses it except, intellectuals and scholars. Hegemony, the idea that there are certain ideas that are so baked in as the way things ought to be that even the people that don't benefit from them accept them. So slavery is just what slavery is, and so you accept its normalcy for some people that are in it. But yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, even Thomas Jefferson was raised, by a black nursemaid and had real affection for her, but then had to sort of be taught as he grew up. He had to be taught racism. He had to be taught these black people were, God wanted them to serve you. To perpetuate the institution, you had to sort of educate people in that rationale for it. But that didn't mean that enslavers and enslaved did not sometimes form close relationships with each other, that they lived close together, and they could have affection for each other.
Any other questions or comments?
Uh-huh. Huh.
So I went up to the man who was in charge, who was the doctorate, and I said to him, "Where is the West Virginia flag?" "Oh, it's there." I said, "No, it's not." "Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is." He was very, He went over and pulled out the Virginia flag. And I said to him, are you serious? Are you telling me, well, aren't you part of Virginia? This man was so educated. I gave him a whole lecture. He walked away.
Well, good for you. Good for you.
We want to add one thing. Remember, this guy was a PhD from Texas. She saw him the next day and introduced him to some folks as the gentleman from eastern Oklahoma.
That's, oh, that's a great story.
You mentioned in talking about the seal and the Coopers who made, of course, the barrels.
Yeah.
But the most recent question going around now is, what's in the barrels? Whiskey, gunpowder, what's in the barrels?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so it could have been a lot of things. I mean, barrels are a symbol of commerce in this time period because so many things. We didn't have plastic, that so many things are either in wet or dry barrels. But yeah, it could have been whiskey, could have been gunpowder, could have been.
There was a contest that just ended, I think yesterday, the end of June, and it was questions about our state insignia
Oh,
up there.
okay.
And I can't remember exactly, the main question may have been about the Phrygian cap, but I immediately, as soon as I saw the questions that were on this contest, I said, one of those barrels had to be, of course, everybody knows, whiskey, homemade whiskey.
Yep.
But I think the other one had to be cider,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
or Applejack at least.
Well, you're talking my language, since my Johnny Appleseed book was also about the history of cider and in the Middle America. So yeah, cider is really important in the 19th century, mostly homegrown. Yeah,
Right. And the yellow apples started here too.
that's right. Yeah, and the Grimes Golden was from just up the road from here, I think. Yeah, which is a awesome apple. I have a hard time finding them. But apparently, the trees only bear fruit every other year in significant amounts, so they're not commercially very viable. But it's better than the Granny Smith, way better. The Grimes Golden.
We have a question from an online viewer, and I'm going to try to put it in the right words. How do you see, or do you see the current political climate affecting how history is taught, specifically about West Virginia and also in general American history?
Oh, that's a big question, and I think it's a wait and see. I mean, I do know that there is a broad feeling that I just retired from a university just a month ago. There's a broad feeling that academia has been portraying American history in too negative a light, that there's too much focus on the dark side and not on the achievements. This is a trick because when we think about history, I know in Ohio they used to give students a test called the citizenship test they had to take, and a lot of the questions were about history. And what that reveals is we see knowing your history as an important part of being a citizen, of feeling a bond to your state, your country. So history is therefore more politically fraught than a lot of other areas because we put a lot on its shoulders, particularly your own national history. I mean, it's much easier for us to sort of say, wasn't it terrible, what the Germans did in World War II? And we have, Holocaust museums in the United States, one in Washington. But it's harder for any nation to grapple with their own shortcomings as a nation, and makes people uncomfortable. And if you believe that one of the main reasons to teach history in the schools is to inculcate a love of country, inculcate citizenship and patriotism. That's why I think politics gets tied up. I mean, the flip side is, well, we want to learn from the past. We want to be better. We want to progress, and therefore we have to confront the reality of shortcomings, national shortcomings. So I don't know. I can't predict what the current political climate will mean for how history is taught in the schools and how that bubbles up to the universities. But history has always been on that razor's edge of politics because, particularly national history, we invest a lot in it, and as part of how we inculcate citizenship and civic virtue and patriotism into our youth. I think that's probably punting on the question, but I think we also probably have lots of different viewpoints about what history should be taught and should not be taught. You know, we don't have these fights about what should be taught in a chemistry class. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all.